Hello. Good evening tonight. We're diving into the glittering, unsettling, almost mechanical mind of a man who once said, "I think everyone should be a machine." But what did he really mean? Was he joking? Or was he predicting the future, our future, where every face, every selfie, every product we touch is part of the same endless loop of images? The man behind that eerie prophecy was Andy Warhol, the pale king of pop, a figure so still and quiet that people mistook him for simple until they realized he'd turned the entire modern world into his canvas. There's something strange about Andy's story. It's not the usual poor boy becomes artist tale, nor the romantic struggle of a starving painter chasing truth. No. His journey feels more like a fever dream in silver and static one where beauty hides in the supermarket aisle, where fame is mass-produced, and where art stops being sacred and starts being suspiciously familiar. Tonight, we're not just looking at Warhol. We're stepping inside the world he built, a world where everything, from a can of soup to your own reflection, could be art. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Then, down in the comments, tell me your city and the time right now. I want to know which night sky this story is falling under. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this: Pittsburgh, 1,930 seconds. A city wrapped in smoke, where every breath tastes faintly of steel. Inside a narrow apartment, a sickly boy lies in bed, sketching faces from old newspapers because his body won't let him run outside. His name is Andrew Warhol. His hands tremble when he draws, but somehow the lines hold steady enough to capture something alive. Outside, factories roar. Inside, a frail child quietly rewires the meaning of beauty. His mother, Julia, hums in Slovak as she cuts flowers out of tin cans, arranging them along the windowsill. She can't afford real ones. The boy watches her work, fascinated by the shimmer of metal in the light. He doesn't know it yet, but those little flowers, the mix of homemade and industrial, of love and mass production, will stay inside him forever. Andy spends most of his childhood alone, trapped by a nervous system illness that makes his body jerk unpredictably. The walls of his room become both his cage and his gallery. When his mother brings him fashion magazines from the grocery store, he doesn't just look at the models. He studies the typography, the shoes, the shine on the lipstick. He's learning something most adults never notice: that desire can be designed. No one could have guessed that this quiet, pale boy, too shy to speak in class, too frail to play outside, would one day force the entire art world to confront its own reflection. Yet that's where all revolutions begin, isn't it? Not with fireworks, but with someone staring too long at something ordinary and daring to see it differently. There's an image people often forget. Before the wigs, before the celebrities, before the factory walls dripped in silver paint, there was a little boy tracing the same image again and again because he liked the feeling of repetition. That's the seed of pop art right there, blooming in a Pittsburgh living room with cracked plaster and the faint sound of radio static. Even as a child, Andy is haunted by a strange question. What makes something important? Is it beauty, rarity, or simply the fact that everyone looks at it at once? He doesn't know yet, but he's already searching for an answer in the hum of refrigerators and the smooth curve of Coca-Cola bottles. That's the first spark of his lifelong obsession: the poetry of the mass-produced. And while the rest of the world rushes toward greatness, Andy grows fascinated with sameness, with the dream that art doesn't have to be about the extraordinary, but about how the ordinary repeats itself until it becomes sacred. By the time he leaves for art school, he's already quietly collecting the raw material of his future revolution: repetition, imperfection, imitation, shine. But here's the mystery. How does a shy boy who can barely speak above a whisper end up becoming the loudest voice in 20th century art? How does someone who hides behind wigs and cameras become the mirror of an entire culture? That's the puzzle we'll try to solve tonight. Because somewhere between a trembling hand and a glossy photograph, Andy Warhol found a way to change not just art, but the very way we see ourselves. The year is 1949. The war is over, America is buzzing again, and New York is the center of everything: money, ambition, and glamour, all wrapped in neon. The city smells like ink, cigarettes, and possibility. Young Andy Warhol steps off the bus with a suitcase full of drawings, $20 in his pocket, and a head full of quiet panic. He's 21 years old, awkward, and still mumbling his last name with that faint Pittsburgh accent, Warholer. It sounds foreign, soft around the edges. Within months he'll drop the A. He'll learn that in this city, even names need to be streamlined. New York in the late 1940s isn't exactly welcoming to shy dreamers. Artists are either starving or swaggering, and Andy is neither. He's somewhere in between, a fragile creature in a city of noise. But he's got something they don't: an eye for beauty that doesn't shout. His art professors once said his work looked too commercial. Well, that's the point. Andy doesn't want to paint feelings. He wants to paint the surface, because in a world obsessed with surfaces, that's where the truth hides. He rents a small room on East 75th Street, shared with two other hopefuls. It smells like turpentine and boiled cabbage. The walls are thin enough that he can hear jazz from the apartment next door. He spends his days carrying his portfolio from magazine to magazine: Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Glamour, trying to sell himself as a commercial illustrator. Most doors close politely. A few close less politely. But one day, a small miracle, Glamour says yes. They give him a commission to illustrate women's shoes for an article titled "Success is a Job in New York." It's almost too perfect. He works all night, carefully blotting ink with paper to create soft, trembling lines. The result is delicate, a little strange shoes that seem to breathe. When the magazine comes out, his name is spelled Warhol. A typo, perhaps, but he keeps it. Warhol sounds faster, more modern, more American. Just like that, Andy Warhol is born. Success doesn't arrive like thunder. It drips in slowly, like the ink he blots onto paper. He starts getting steady illustration: work shoes, handbags, perfume bottles, everything feminine, elegant, fleeting. His style is instantly recognizable: thin, nervous lines with a sense of fragility, as if the paper might collapse under too much emotion. But it's not emotion he's after, it's attention. Here's where Andy makes his first quiet rebellion. In the world of advertising, artists are invisible. Their job is to sell the product, not themselves. But Andy, always sly, begins inserting his name, handwritten, decorative, playful, into every illustration. Andy Warhol becomes part of the design itself. He's branding himself before anyone else thinks to. In a way, he becomes his own advertisement. Still, he doesn't quite fit in anywhere. He's too artistic for the ad world, too commercial for the art world. He spends hours at Serendipity 3, a cafe where artists and models mingle under dim lights and pink neon. He sketches on napkins, talks in whispers, observes everyone. Friends describe him as both there and not there, like a ghost with impeccable taste. There's a rumor, one of those stories that may or may not be true, that Warhol once spent his last few dollars on a jar of instant coffee and a new wig. He said the wig made him feel neater. The truth is, he's already constructing his persona, layer by layer, like an artwork. The pale skin, the monotone voice, the gentle distance. It's not shyness anymore. It's performance. Meanwhile, his art begins to shift. He experiments with repetition, copying the same shoe over and over. Sometimes he changes the color, sometimes not. He calls it playing with beauty. But under the surface, something radical is happening. He's teaching himself how to make art mechanical. Historians still debate this. Some say it was a practical choice. Repetition made his commercial work faster. Others argue it was philosophical, an early form of protest against authenticity. After all, if a machine can reproduce beauty endlessly, what does that say about originality? Warhol doesn't explain. He never does. He just smiles and keeps drawing. One night, after a long day of failed pitches, Andy visits the Museum of Modern Art. He stands in front of a Jackson Pollock painting drips, chaos, wild movement, and feels nothing. It's too emotional, too human. He turns away, almost embarrassed. Later he tells a friend, "I like things that look like they were made by accident, or by a factory." That single thought plants the seed for everything that comes next. The 1,950 seconds roll forward. Andy earns more commissions, buys better wigs, and begins decorating his apartment with silver foil and found objects. He throws tiny dinner parties where everyone sits in awkward silence while he plays a single song on repeat. "It helps people think," he says. Some think he's joking, others realize he's dead serious. He becomes fascinated by the supermarket, the bright packaging, the smiling faces on cereal boxes, the seductive order of endless sameness. He starts collecting labels, cutting them out, arranging them on his wall like a shrine. The boundary between art and advertising blurs until it disappears entirely. And somewhere inside all that noise and color, Andy begins to see the future. The idea that art doesn't have to be sacred, that it can live on grocery shelves, billboards, and TV screens. He's still just a commercial artist for now, but the blueprint of pop art is already forming in his quiet sketches. There's one final story from this period that feels almost cinematic. Late one evening, Andy is walking home from a magazine office when he passes a store window. Behind the glass are rows of identical Coca-Cola bottles, perfectly lined up, glowing under fluorescent light. He stops and stares. The reflection of the bottles doubles in the glass, infinite and symmetrical. And in that moment, something clicks. He later tells a friend, "You can be drinking the same Coke as the president. It's the same Coke. No better, no worse." It sounds simple, even silly, but it's a revelation. Equality through consumption, a democratic kind of beauty. That thought will haunt him forever, and soon it will change everything. By the early 1,950 seconds, New York is speeding up faster, louder, brighter. The skyline glitters like a movie set, but for artists, it's also a battlefield. The old guard of abstract expressionists, Pollock, de Kooning, Rothko, rule the galleries with dripping paint and tortured emotion. To them, art is suffering. To Andy Warhol, art is packaging. He's tired of pretending that his illustrations are less than, because deep down, he knows he's already doing something revolutionary. He's merging the language of mass culture with fine art before the world even has a name for it. Still, Andy feels invisible. His blotted line drawings get him steady work, but no respect. Gallery owners dismiss him with a polite smile. "You're talented, but it's too commercial." That word commercial cuts like a knife. It's both an insult and a mirror. Every time someone says it, Andy hears the same challenge. Can something commercial ever be art? He decides to find out. His apartment is tiny but spotless, filled with sketches, record sleeves, and stacks of shoe illustrations. The floor is littered with magazines and empty coffee jars. He keeps a small television playing in the corner, almost constantly white noise that makes the silence easier to bear. Visitors say stepping inside feels like entering someone's mind, everything arranged, catalogued, repeated. Andy starts pushing his work in new directions. He begins experimenting with printing techniques, silk screening, tracing, copying, anything that gets him closer to the dream of mass production. He wants to make art that anyone could reproduce, art that doesn't depend on the trembling line of a single hand. But there's another reason for this obsession control. His hands still shake sometimes, a ghost of the illness that kept him bedridden as a child. The silk screen offers him escape from his own body. It's a way to make perfection mechanical, to make art that doesn't get tired or tremble. He starts visiting the uptown galleries again, this time as a quiet observer. He studies the works of Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, artists who've begun incorporating everyday objects into their paintings. Flags, numbers, newspaper scraps. It's bold, conceptual, and exactly the kind of rebellion that thrills him. But Andy wants to go further. He doesn't want to borrow from popular culture, he wants to become it. Historians still debate when that turning point happens. Some say it's 1956, when he visits an exhibition called This Is Tomorrow in London, filled with collages of advertising imagery. Others argue it's the first time he walks through a grocery store and realizes that a can of soup might be more iconic than a classical statue. Whichever it was, something clicks. He begins painting not what people feel, but what they buy. At first, no one gets it. His friends think it's a joke. Why would anyone paint something as dull as a soup can or a Coke bottle? But Andy is playing a longer game. He knows that the most ordinary things often hide the deepest truths about a society. A Coke is a Coke, he says, and no amount of money can make it better than the one the bum on the corner drinks. That line, tossed off so casually, is his philosophy in miniature, the democracy of consumption. He's still doing illustration work to survive, but his notebooks start filling with strange repetitions, rows of identical objects, drawn over and over. Shoes, bottles, faces, each one a little different, yet eerily the same. It's practice for what's coming. And then there's the wigs. The first ones are just for fun, a costume for parties. But soon they become armor, a way to hide the thinning hair, yes, but also a way to disappear, to blur Andy the man into Andy the idea. Under the wig, he becomes a blank surface, a living symbol of his own aesthetic. Around this time, he meets a circle of young bohemians drifting between the advertising world and the art scene. There's Truman Capote, his idol, the person he sends fan letters to almost weekly. There's the fashion crowd, with their glossy smiles and quick judgments. And there's a growing number of disillusioned artists tired of abstraction and existential despair. They start gathering at bars in Midtown, murmuring about something new, something brighter, faster, less heavy. Pop art isn't born yet, but its pulse is quickening. Andy starts experimenting at home with the idea of serial beauty. He paints simple images, Coke bottles, comic panels, dollar signs again and again, lining them up in grids. He's fascinated by the rhythm of sameness, by how repetition can both comfort and disturb. When a friend asks him why he keeps painting the same object, Andy replies, "Because I like seeing things over and over. It makes them important." It's both innocent and deeply philosophical. In an era obsessed with originality, he's asking whether repetition might be its own kind of truth. Critics later say this is where he began redefining what art could be. But at the time, it just feels like instinct. Andy doesn't theorize, he collects. Every detail of modern life becomes a potential artwork. Supermarket labels, celebrity headshots, price tags. He hoards them in boxes, calling them time capsules. What most people throw away, he saves. What most people ignore, he worships. There's another story from these years, one that art historians love to debate. Apparently, a gallery owner once told Andy that his paintings were too nice. The edges were clean, the colors polite, the compositions symmetrical. They're not messy enough to be serious art, she said. Andy nodded politely, went home, and added even more polish. When a friend asked him why, he replied, "If everyone's dripping, I'll be neat. If everyone's loud, I'll whisper." It's the essence of his rebellion, doing the opposite of what's expected until the world has no choice but to look. By the late 1950s, Andy is making real money from his illustrations. He throws small dinner parties for art directors, serves soup straight from the can, and calls it performance. His apartment walls are painted silver, a color he says makes everything more exciting. His friends find it eccentric. He calls it modern. But beneath the quirky surface, there's tension. Andy feels the limits of commercial art closing in. He wants something bigger, something that can't be contained in the pages of a fashion magazine. His notebooks are filled with sketches of mass-produced icons, Coca-Cola bottles, dollar bills, soup cans. He's drawing the same objects he's surrounded by daily, but now with reverence, almost as if they're religious symbols. And maybe, in a strange way, they are. Because for Andy, America itself is a kind of church, and its saints are brands. Soon, he'll turn that revelation into the foundation of pop art. But for now, he's still the quiet man behind the ads, waiting for the right moment to show the world that beauty, like fame, can come in bulk. By the time the 1960 seconds cracked open like a can of bright paint, Andy Warhol had learned one unshakable truth. If the world wouldn't take him seriously, he'd make them stare instead. He began with a simple disguise, though it would become one of the most recognizable silhouettes in 20th century art. That shock of silver hair wasn't just a wig, it was armor. A deliberate shimmer that told the world, "You can look, but you'll never see the real me." The platinum strands caught the studio lights like tinsel, giving him a strange, celestial glow. Beneath it, Andy's pale face was an enigma, emotionless, distant, yet oddly magnetic, like a ghost haunting his own fame. People whispered about him at parties in Soho and uptown openings. Who is he? Is he serious? Or is this all a joke? Andy loved those questions. In fact, he built his empire on them. His studio, now pulsing with the sound of tape recorders, clicking cameras, and the hum of silkscreen machines, became the stage for his next revolution. Warhol had discovered a process that made him both artist and machine, a way to reproduce images endlessly, like the assembly lines that produced the consumer goods he adored. One night, with a few cans of metallic paint, he began to experiment. Why paint something once, he mused, when you can print it again and again until it becomes eternal? Soon, Marilyn Monroe stared back at him in electric pinks and acid yellows. Elvis stood frozen mid-draw, gun in hand, multiplied across silver panels. Coca-Cola bottles, Campbell's soup cans, and dollar bills became the new icons of his faith, a religion of repetition. The critics didn't know what to do with him. Some called it genius. Others called it garbage. But Andy didn't mind. "If people don't like what I do," he shrugged, "I just do more of it." As the 1960 seconds roared on, his art became inseparable from the decade itself, commercial, chaotic, and brilliantly superficial. Collectors who once dismissed him as a gimmick now lined up to buy his prints. The shy boy who once feared being seen was now photographed everywhere, his blank stare printed in glossy magazines beside the same celebrities he'd once only dreamed of meeting. But fame, Andy discovered, was a double-edged mirror. On one side was admiration, attention, money, On the other, the slow suffocation of privacy, the feeling of being watched even when alone. He began recording his friends' constantly conversations, laughter, silences turning their lives into art, and their identities into material. And in the center of it all stood Andy, silent, watchful, turning every human moment into a product. There was something unsettling about how calmly he consumed the world around him. He once said, "I like boring things," but in truth, he liked predictable things, the control of replication, the safety of sameness. Every print, every movie reel, every photo was another way to freeze time, to turn chaos into pattern. By 1964, he'd stopped painting by hand altogether. Assistants took over, silk screening his designs in production lines that looked eerily like factories, hence the nickname that would define the next era, the factory. And when people asked him what it all meant, whether he was mocking capitalism or celebrating it, he only smiled and said, "Making money is art, and good business is the best art." But behind that silver wig and those mirrored sunglasses, a question began to form, one he'd never quite answer. If everything could be copied, faces, emotions, fame itself, what was left that was real? The factory would soon become the place where that question spiraled out of control, where Andy's obsession with fame and repetition would collide with the chaos of real, unpredictable people. And in the shadows of silver-painted walls, the next act of his story was already waiting, brighter, louder, and far more dangerous. There was never a place quite like it before, and there will never be one quite like it again. When people first stepped into the factory, they felt disoriented, as if they had stumbled into some kind of metallic dream. Every wall was covered in silver foil and mirrors, the ceiling shimmered under harsh lights, and the air buzzed with the constant whirl of ideas, laughter, and the low hum of tape recorders running endlessly in the background. It wasn't just a studio. It was a world, a laboratory of chaos, a church of celebrity, and a stage where reality dissolved into art. Andy Warhol had turned his work into a social ecosystem. Musicians, poets, models, drag queens, filmmakers, and random strangers drifted through the silver doors each day. Some came looking for fame, others for love, and many for something that couldn't be named. Everyone wanted to be a superstar. They painted together, posed for photographs, made strange underground films, and stayed up until dawn discussing beauty, boredom, and fame, as if those words were holy scripture. Andy, always quiet and oddly detached, observed them through his Polaroid lens, like a scientist watching a glittering species evolve. He rarely gave instructions. Instead, he let the room create itself. "Just be yourself," he'd murmur, his voice flat and unhurried, "and I'll make you a movie star." And somehow, they believed him. The factory pulsed to the beat of the 1,960 seconds. Velvet Underground rehearsing in one corner, Edie Sedgwick dancing on the silver couch in another, Nico humming softly under her breath while Andy filmed everything without blinking. The place smelled of paint, perfume, and exhaustion. "Everyone's famous for 15 minutes, Andy said once, and in the factory, that prophecy came true. The camera loved anyone who dared to look into it. People became art simply by being there. But the factory wasn't all glitter and grace. Behind the silver walls, darkness grew. Andy's obsession with documenting life began to devour the lives themselves. His superstars Edie, Candy Darling, Ondine, Gerard Malanga, became trapped between who they were and who Andy's camera said they were. Reality blurred. The performances never stopped. Even when the cameras weren't rolling, they acted. Drugs drifted in like snowflakes. Heroin, amphetamines, pills that kept the artists awake for days and sent them spiraling into paranoia. They said Andy didn't take them, he didn't have to. His addiction was to people, to watching them unravel, He filmed it all. Every tear, every breakdown, every glittering confession. His films, Sleep, Empire, Chelsea Girls, tested what art could even mean. Some were 8 hours long, showing nothing but stillness, daring the audience to feel boredom as enlightenment. Critics hated them. The underground adored them. Andy smiled at both reactions. To him, any attention was a kind of success. But even as the factory shone brighter, Andy began to fade further into the background. His voice, once an awkward whisper, became an echo behind the noise of the people he'd created. He watched his superstars burn with brilliance and then collapse under the weight of their own illusions. Edie Sedgwick, his most famous muse, became the face of that tragedy. A girl of golden hair and desperate eyes, she was New York's obsession until she wasn't. Her fame came fast, her fall faster. When she drifted away from the factory, broken and addicted, Andy didn't chase after her. He only said softly, "Oh, she was great while she lasted." His detachment wasn't cruelty, it was fear. The closer people came, the faster they burned out. So Andy learned to keep everyone at arm's length, behind a lens, behind silver walls. Still, something began to fracture. Fame was becoming dangerous. And Andy, the man who built an empire of icons, was about to learn that even he couldn't control the chaos he'd created. By 1967, the factory had turned from a creative playground into a volatile storm. There were jealousies, betrayals, lawsuits, addictions. Andy smiled through it all, still making art, still filming faces. But the gleam in his silver world began to dim. He once said, "In the future, everyone will want to be famous." But in that shimmering room, the future was already here and fame was eating people alive. The next chapter of Andy's story would begin not with a painting, not with a camera, but with a gunshot that shattered everything. By the late 1960s, the factory was no longer just a studio, it was an orbiting planet of fame, spinning faster than even Andy Warhol could control. The silver walls still gleamed, the parties still stretched into the morning, but beneath the shimmer, there was a quiet decay setting in. Fame had started to taste metallic, like the foil on the walls, shiny, artificial, and a little toxic. Andy walked through this glittering maze like a ghost. He watched, listened, and occasionally tilted his head, Polaroid camera in hand, as though he could capture truth by catching light, but the truth was slipping through everyone's fingers. The superstars, those beautiful, strange souls who had once filled the factory with energy, were beginning to vanish one by one. Edie Sedgwick, once Andy's brightest muse, had drifted into self-destruction. Gerard Malanga, the dancer and assistant who once worshipped Andy, now whispered about betrayal. Others fell into addiction or simply disappeared into the cracks of New York's endless night. It's said that Andy kept working because stopping would mean feeling. His art became colder, flatter, more mechanical. The silk screens multiplied like machinery, Marilyn's face, Elvis's hips, Mao's portrait. Each repeated image seemed to ask the same unspoken question: is this all people want? He was surrounded by fame, yet lonelier than ever. The people who once adored him now accused him of using them, of stealing their light. And maybe they were right. But Andy didn't see it that way. To him, everything and everyone was material, beautiful, tragic, marketable material. Still, even Warhol could sense the storm approaching. Outside the factory, America was changing. The optimism of the early 1960s had curdled into chaos, Vietnam protests, civil rights struggles, and a growing suspicion of the media. The same world that made Andy a star was starting to turn against the very idea of celebrity worship. His cool detachment, once seen as visionary, now looked almost cruel in the face of real suffering. And then there was Valerie Solanas. She was a writer, a feminist, and a frequent visitor at the factory, brilliant, paranoid, and furious at a world that ignored her. She had written something called the Scum Manifesto, declaring war on the patriarchy. Andy, always curious about strange minds, had given her small roles in his films. But when he lost one of her manuscripts, perhaps by accident, perhaps not something in her snapped. Historians still argue about this moment. Some say Andy dismissed her out of boredom. Others claim he genuinely feared her. What's certain is that on the 3rd of June 1968, she walked into the factory with a gun. The silver dream shattered with the sound of gunfire. Valerie shot Andy 3 times at close range. The bullets tore through his chest and abdomen. He collapsed, his silver wig slipping off, his blood staining the floor that had once sparkled with glitter. For a few moments, the factory, the heart of pop art, was filled with the sound of chaos and disbelief. He was rushed to the hospital and pronounced clinically dead for several minutes before being revived. The surgeons performed a grueling 5-hour operation. When Andy finally woke, his first words, weak and trembling, were, "Oh, I get it. I'm dead." He wasn't wrong. The Andy Warhol that emerged from that hospital bed was not the same man who had entered the factory years before. His once pale skin now bore a deep scar stretching from chest to stomach, like a zipper holding him together. The wig became more than a symbol, it was armor now. Protection from the world that had almost ended him. He withdrew from the chaotic community he had built. The factory moved locations, became quieter, more controlled. The days of wild creativity were over. In their place, Andy built a system: business meetings, magazine shoots, commissioned portraits. If the old factory had been a dream, the new one was an office. But even in retreat, he never stopped watching. He turned his camera toward the idea of death itself. Electric chairs, car crashes, skulls, and the haunting image of Jackie Kennedy frozen in grief, these became his new subjects. There was irony in it, of course. The man who once turned soup cans into icons was now confronting mortality through repetition. But repetition was his way of surviving it. If he could print death 100 times, maybe it would lose its power. And yet, it didn't. Every night, he still feared someone would finish what Valerie had started. He rarely left his home without bodyguards. He avoided confrontation, avoided deep connections, avoided above all being truly seen. Still, his art never lost its edge. He began painting portraits for the wealthy socialites, royalty, movie stars. Each face became another mask, another version of fame. His critics accused him of selling out. Andy didn't argue. "Good business is the best art," he said. And perhaps he meant it. But those who knew him best could see the sadness behind the shimmer. The factory was no longer a playground, it was a reflection chamber. Every flashbulb, every silkscreen, every celebrity who sat for him was another mirror showing him how far he'd drifted from the boy in Pittsburgh who just wanted to draw. Historians still debate whether Andy's shooting killed the artist or created a new one. Some say it deepened his art, giving it gravity. Others insist it hollowed him out completely, leaving only the performance. The truth, as always with Warhol, lies somewhere in the reflection. Because even as he grew quieter, the world around him grew louder, hungrier for fame, for image, for instant recognition. And while Andy had stepped back from the spotlight, his philosophy had already escaped him, spreading through advertising, television, and the beginnings of celebrity culture as we know it. The man who once said, In the future, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes, was about to see his prophecy become terrifyingly real. Next came the era when Andy Warhol would no longer just be an artist, he would become a brand, a self-contained myth, and the first artist to truly sell himself like a product. The question was, could a man who survived death also survive fame itself? The gunshot should have ended Andy Warhol's story. By every account, it nearly did. Doctors didn't expect him to survive. His lungs had collapsed, his gallbladder was destroyed, and one of the bullets had torn straight through his torso, missing his heart by an inch. His skin, once ghostly pale by choice, now looked like parchment stretched over a haunted frame. Machines kept him breathing. His friends waited in the hospital hallways, whispering that the man who had defined the 1,960 seconds might never open his eyes again. But Andy did wake up. Slowly. Painfully. Confused. His first words, faint and dry, were something between a joke and a whisper. "Oh, I get it. I'm dead." It was the kind of sentence only Andy could deliver, half tragedy, half irony, spoken from the blurry space between art and afterlife. When he finally returned home, everything had changed. The factory, the living, laughing organism of art and madness was gone. The silver walls had been dismantled, the laughter replaced with the hum of photocopiers. Friends came less often. Fame, which once swirled around him like perfume, now felt heavy and invasive. Even his own reflection began to terrify him. The shooting didn't just wound his body, it rewired his mind. He became obsessive about security, afraid of elevators, and anxious in crowds. He hired bodyguards. He refused to go anywhere alone. And above all, he started to see the world not as a playground, but as a fragile film reel that could tear at any second. It was as if the man who made the world shine in Technicolor had woken up in grayscale. He worked differently now, mechanically, methodically, like an assembly line. Some said he was hiding behind his machines, the tape recorders, the Polaroid cameras, the assistants who completed his silkscreens while he gave short, distracted instructions. Others said he was simply evolving, turning the human touch into an industrial gesture. Either way, he no longer trusted the unpredictable energy that once defined his art. And yet, the silence gave birth to something new. After the shooting, Andy became obsessed with the theme of death, but not in a gothic way. He treated it with the same detached curiosity he once reserved for soup cans. Electric chairs, car crashes, suicides, celebrity funerals, he printed and reprinted them, turning human tragedy into cold, mesmerizing repetition. It was unsettling. Audiences didn't know whether to feel horror or awe. The paintings seemed to whisper a question no one wanted to answer. If we see something enough times, does it stop hurting? Critics called this his post-human phase. Others said it was simply trauma turned into technique. But for Andy, it was more than that. He wasn't painting death, he was painting his death, again and again, as if trying to understand how he had survived it. He began going to church again, quietly, secretly. He sat in the back pews of Street Vincent Ferrers, blending into the shadows. Few people knew he had been raised Catholic. Even fewer understood how deeply that faith had shaped him. The man who built a career worshipping celebrity was now kneeling before silence. Still, he didn't abandon the world, far from it. He returned to work with an eerie discipline, producing commissioned portraits for socialites, movie stars, and politicians. Each one perfectly polished, perfectly empty. Business art, he called it. Being good in business is the most fascinating kind of art. People laughed, but he wasn't joking. To Andy, survival meant adapting, and in the new era of the 1970 seconds, adaptation meant commerce. He started Interview magazine, a glossy conversation between art and fame. Its tagline, "The Crystal Ball of Pop," captured his strange genius. He saw the world not for what it was, but for what it was becoming. The magazine became a hub for the new generation designers, actors, musicians who worshipped Andy as both relic and oracle. They'd visit his studio now, a more sterile, organized factory, and find him behind dark sunglasses, surrounded by telephones and assistants, answering every question with a soft, ambiguous, "Oh, I don't know." But underneath that, carefully rehearsed detachment was exhaustion. The shooting had left him with chronic pain. He had to wear a medical corset under his clothes for the rest of his life. Every breath reminded him that he had been broken and patched back together. He began recording his daily life, obsessively taped diaries, phone calls, notes about who he saw and what they said. It was as if he feared disappearing unless every second was documented. Historians still argue whether this was control or surrender. Was he mastering his narrative, or was he letting technology and habit replace feeling altogether? What's certain is that the Warhol who survived the bullets no longer wanted chaos. The wild parties, the screaming fame chasers, the drugs they were replaced by a ritual of work, routine, and reflection. But the silence he built around himself didn't protect him from loneliness. Friends noticed how he drifted in conversations, how he rarely made eye contact anymore. Even when surrounded by people, Andy seemed to exist one layer removed, half here, half in a mirrored world of his own. And then came the haunting realization. His own prophecy had come true. In the future, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. He'd said it once as a joke, but now he saw it unfolding in real time. Television shows, tabloids, and glossy magazines were mass-producing fame the way he once mass-produced art. He had turned culture into a copy machine, and now the machine was running without him. Still, he couldn't stop. Art, for him, had become survival, a way to keep breathing through the silence. He began painting portraits of death and resurrection, of fading icons and religious imagery. Christ multiplied on canvas like Marilyn once had, but this time there was no irony. There was reverence. If the factory had been his temple of fame, his studio now became his confessional. And perhaps that's the paradox that defined him most. The man who made the world louder found peace only in quiet. By the mid-1970 seconds, Andy Warhol was both everywhere and nowhere. His image on TV, his name in magazines, his presence like a shadow cast over every conversation about art, fame, or meaning. He had survived death, but something in him remained permanently on the other side of it. His next evolution would push the contradiction even further. The man who feared death would turn himself into a living logo, a brand so large that no bullet could ever kill it again. Andy Warhol never really believed in the romantic myth of the tortured artist. He believed in invoices, deadlines, and exposure. After surviving the shooting and rebuilding his world, he decided that if life was fragile, then fame and business were the only reliable currencies. He once said with that strange, unblinking calm, "Making money is art, and working is art. And good business is the best art. It is." To some, it sounded cynical. To Andy, it was liberation. He wasn't retreating from creativity, he was re-engineering it. The 1970 seconds and 80 seconds would see Andy Warhol become something far stranger than just a painter or filmmaker. He would become a corporation with a soul, if that phrase even makes sense. He built a new factory, more organized and efficient than the chaotic silver paradise of the past, gone were the drug-fueled parties and spontaneous screen tests. In their place, phones ringing, assistants typing, clients visiting for portraits, and the faint scent of commercial varnish replacing cigarette smoke. He was no longer surrounded by lost poets and misfits, but by socialites, CEOs, and debutantes, the new aristocracy of the postmodern age. Everyone wanted a Warhol portrait. The Shah of Iran, Mick Jagger, Liza Minnelli, Muhammad Ali, even the Queen of England. If the factory of the 1960 seconds had been an experiment in fame, this new one was a factory of image production, clean, efficient, and unapologetically transactional. Andy would take Polaroids of his subjects, select the most striking one, and then his team would turn it into a silk screen on canvas. His assistants did the coloring, but Andy's signature, both literal and aesthetic, made it art. Critics scoffed. They called him a sellout, an advertiser masquerading as an artist. But Andy didn't mind. He had learned long ago that scandal was simply another form of currency. They always say time changes things, he once shrugged, but you actually have to change them yourself. And so he did. He blurred the line between art and brand, celebrity and product, long before words like marketing or influencer culture entered the mainstream. He started showing up at fashion shows, nightclubs, TV talk shows, and corporate events, not to promote art, but to be art. His presence alone turned ordinary moments into performance. At Studio 54, the neon cathedral of New York nightlife, Andy became both priest and prophet. He stood quietly in a corner, camera in hand, documenting everyone else: models, moguls, drag queens, politicians, all glowing in the strobe light of their own self-importance. People lined up just to be seen by him. He didn't need to dance or shout. Just being Andy Warhol was enough. His camera, ever hungry, became his diary. Thousands of Polaroids captured fleeting glamour. A smile frozen mid-laugh, a champagne glass half raised, a superstar about to fade. He turned these images into portraits that were less about individuality and more about the flattening effect of fame itself. Everyone, rich or poor, famous or forgotten, looked the same when filtered through his silk screen. This wasn't coincidence, it was the point. Andy's new art wasn't just about what he painted, it was about the system that produced it. He turned capitalism into an artistic medium, treating repetition, branding, and visibility as creative acts. His critics missed the joke. He wasn't mocking the commercial world. He was absorbing it, transforming it into culture. At the same time, he started a new venture, Interview magazine. It was glossy, playful, and drenched in celebrity, the kind of publication that perfectly reflected his world. Andy called it the crystal ball of pop. The interviews weren't deep or investigative. They were more like whispered conversations overheard at a party. But that was precisely what made them revolutionary. They captured the sound of fame talking to itself. By the 1980 seconds, Andy had become a brand before brands existed. He collaborated with fashion designers, endorsed products, and appeared in TV commercials. He turned his own persona into a kind of performance art: flat voice, silver wig, dark glasses, and that signature pause before every answer. He once said, "If you want to know all about Andy Warhol, just look at the surface of my paintings and films and me, there I am. There's nothing behind it." But there was something behind it, always. Those who knew him privately, like his close friend and editor Pat Hackett, said Andy was far more insecure and introspective than his public mask suggested. He worried about aging, about relevance, about dying unnoticed despite his fame. His diaries from this time are filled with phone calls, shopping lists, and anxious musings about being out of the loop. He'd built an empire of surface, but even he couldn't escape what lay underneath. Still, he kept working. The energy of New York in the 80 seconds was electric graffiti, punk, street art, new money, old ambition, Young artists like Jean-Michel Basquiat and Keith Haring started orbiting around him. Andy, always attuned to the future, saw in them a kind of raw, dangerous beauty that reminded him of his own early chaos. He began collaborating with them, Warhol's silk screens layered with Basquiat's graffiti lines, a dialogue between two generations. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some saw genius, others saw exploitation. Andy didn't argue. He simply smiled and kept painting. What fascinated him wasn't control anymore, but connection, the strange dance between youth and fame, legacy and relevance. He wasn't the king of pop art anymore. He was the elder ghost haunting the world he had created. And yet, he thrived. The world that once mocked him for being commercial had now fully embraced his vision. Television was obsessed with image. Advertising was poetry. Every celebrity was a self-curated brand. The future had arrived, and it spoke in Warhol's language. Still, there was an unease beneath it all. Andy's eyes, those pale, unreadable eyes, often seemed tired, even when his smile stayed fixed. He could feel the world accelerating around him, fame moving faster, attention spans shortening, everything becoming more disposable. He had built a culture where everyone wanted to be seen, but no one wanted to feel. Historians still debate what Andy truly believed at this stage. Did he see himself as a prophet or a prisoner of his own ideas? Some say he was laughing at the absurdity of modern fame. Others say he was quietly terrified by what he'd unleashed. What's undeniable is that Andy Warhol had transformed not only the art world but the entire visual culture of the 20th century. He made ordinary things extraordinary, and extraordinary things ordinary. He turned the mirror of modern life toward itself and found everyone already posing. But as the 1,980 seconds neared their end, a new obsession began to consume him: mortality, faith, and the uneasy shadow of time. The man who once painted soup cans and celebrities would now turn to skulls, crosses, and the haunting image of his own reflection. The surface was about to crack. There's a strange kind of silence that often follows fame, like a party that's gone too long into the night. The laughter fades, the champagne goes flat, and suddenly everyone's whispering instead of shouting. That's the world Andy Warhol finds himself in by the late 1970 seconds. His face is everywhere. His art sold for sums he couldn't have imagined a decade earlier, yet behind the wigs and silver foil, something shifts. Fame, his favorite subject, starts to turn on him. He walks through Studio 54, that disco paradise, like a ghost among stars. Bianca Jagger rides in on a white horse, Truman Capote sips gin, and Liza Minnelli spins in sequins, but Andy just watches, half smiling, camera in hand. He isn't really there for the party. He's collecting faces, gestures, glimmers of celebrity like insects in amber. The flashbulb becomes his shield, the lens his distance from chaos. And though he still gets his photo taken every night, he's lonelier than ever. People begin to notice. He no longer paints the way he used to. Instead of the handmade silk screens and the chaotic layering that once screamed rebellion, his assistants do most of the work now. The factory has become more like an office, less like an artistic playground. The art world starts murmuring, has Andy sold out? Is he still an artist, or just a businessman in a silver wig? The irony, of course, is that Warhol himself had predicted this exact transformation. He once said, "Good business is the best art." Still, something deeper simmers beneath that phrase. He's haunted by his own creation, the mythology of Andy Warhol. The man who made art out of fame has become trapped inside the machinery of fame itself. At night, he writes in his diary pages and pages of dates, people, parties, and prices. It's all facts, no feelings. Yet between the lines, you can sense fatigue, a subtle yearning for something more human than icons and invoices. Then, in 1980, something unexpected happens. Jean-Michel Basquiat bursts into the scene like a meteor, young, wild, brilliant, and unapologetically chaotic. Andy is fascinated. Here's someone who reminds him of his younger self. Bold, misunderstood, hungry. They start collaborating. Their friendship is both tender and tense, like father and son, mentor and rival. Together, they create pieces that merge street graffiti with high art, raw energy with sleek pop minimalism. Critics call it exploitation, others see it as evolution. History is still divided on that point, and scholars continue to debate whether Andy's partnership with Basquiat was an act of generosity, strategy, or desperation. But the truth is, Andy seems alive again. He laughs more, works harder, and ventures into new materials: photography, printmaking, even television. Andy Warhol's TV and Andy Warhol's 15 Minutes give him new platforms to explore the spectacle he's always adored. The irony? The man who revolutionized how fame looks now becomes part of the medium he once dissected. He's interviewing Debbie Harry, Grace Jones, and countless others, icons interviewing icons, all framed in his slow, odd cadence. Yet time catches up quietly. The energy that once powered him through nights at the factory now fades by evening. His body bears the scars of his 1968, shooting a trauma that never truly healed. Friends notice how careful he is with his health, how private he's become about fear. The world, meanwhile, keeps turning faster. Punk gives way to new wave, then to MTV. The Warhol aesthetic is everywhere: commercials, album covers, fashion editorials. But the man himself is receding behind his mirrored glasses. One night, after a gallery opening, Andy confides to a friend that he doesn't dream anymore. He says it like it's just another observation. But it lands heavy. For someone who turned consumerism into poetry and repetition into revelation, losing the ability to dream feels like losing color from a canvas. Still, he keeps producing portraits of politicians, saints, and celebrities, even a haunting Last Supper series that critics now call his final masterpiece. Religious themes, death, redemption, all the things he once kept at arm's length now seep into his work. It's as though he's painting not for galleries anymore, but for himself. When he dies in 1987, after what was supposed to be a routine gallbladder surgery, the shock ripples through the art world. The headlines are immediate: Pope of Pop dead at 58. For days, the front pages show his silver wig, his still face, his vacant stare. People mourn, but also, true to Andy's own prophecy, collect. His prints, once seen as commercial kitsch, now become sacred relics. And here's the strange part: his death feels like one of his own works. Ironic, deliberate, perfectly timed. The man who blurred the line between art and life ends up blurring the line between fame and afterlife. In a way, Andy Warhol never really dies. His image multiplies, endlessly reproduced, just like his silk screens. Maybe that was the point all along, to create a self so iconic that it could outlive the man himself. Because somewhere in the endless mirror maze of celebrity culture, Warhol is still there, watching, recording, reflecting, the silver-haired ghost of pop art, smiling quietly, as if he always knew that someday even his silence would become a spectacle. There's a moment, right after the world loses someone like Andy Warhol, when everything feels a bit too still, like New York has collectively taken a breath but forgotten how to exhale. His studio, once alive with the hum of silk screens and gossip, is now quiet except for the soft clicking of cameras from journalists cataloging what's left behind. Rolls of film, unopened boxes of Polaroids, a mountain of correspondence, wigs, diaries, receipts, his entire life archived with almost clinical precision. And yet, if you stand in the room long enough, you can almost hear him humming under his breath, the echo of a man who turned the ordinary into myth. Warhol's story doesn't end with his death, it metastasizes. His name becomes an industry, his aesthetic a blueprint. Museums start curating retrospectives before the paint on his final canvases even dries. Collectors scramble for authenticity while forgers become more skillful than ever. And in a twist of poetic irony, Warhol's own warning that everything will become a copy of a copy comes true faster than anyone expected. But let's rewind for a second. Before the marble memorials and the glossy coffee table books, there's the question that still haunts scholars, critics, and fans alike. What exactly was Andy Warhol trying to say? Was he mocking consumerism or celebrating it? Did he love fame or merely study it like a scientist peering at bacteria under glass? The academic world still hasn't agreed. Some call him a prophet of postmodernism. Others say he was just a man who knew how to sell things. And perhaps that tension, that unanswerable ambiguity, is exactly what makes his work immortal. In the decades that follow, Warhol's fingerprints spread everywhere. Designers borrow his palette, advertisers his irony, influencers his self-curation, Instagram filters, influencer culture, unboxing videos, all of it carries a faint echo of his logic. The idea that surface is substance, that repetition gives meaning, that fame itself is a kind of art form. He once predicted that, in the future, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes. Little did he know he was describing the algorithmic heartbeat of the 21st century. In art schools, professors still stage heated debates over a can of Campbell's soup. Is this painting about capitalism? One side asks. Or is it just soup? And that's the beauty of it, it's both. Andy never gave straight answers because he understood something fundamental. The viewer's confusion was part of the performance. Art wasn't about clarity, it was about reflection, the kind that forces you to question your own reactions. But the man himself, the human behind the myth, becomes even harder to grasp with each passing year. People remember him as detached, cold, mechanical, yet those who really knew him tell a different story of a shy, Catholic boy from Pittsburgh who prayed daily, who worried about his mother, who drew angels in the margins of his notebooks. His faith, often overlooked, shadows many of his later works. The Last Supper series, for instance, isn't just an ironic gesture, it's intimate, reverent, and oddly confessional. Even his obsession with repetition might not have been just a commentary on consumerism, but on eternity itself. How every act, every image, every face is both fleeting and infinite. In the years after his death, the Andy Warhol Foundation is created, not just to preserve his art, but to manage the sprawling legal, financial, and philosophical mess he left behind. The Foundation's authentication board becomes infamous, ruling some works genuine, others fake, often dividing the art world in half. The debates get heated, lawsuits pile up, and yet through it all, Warhol's legend only grows. Every argument about authenticity becomes, ironically, another layer of his artwork. Meanwhile, his influence spreads beyond the galleries. David Bowie channels him in song, Madonna channels him in attitude, and Jeff Koons channels him in ambition. Even Apple's minimalist design language owes a subtle debt to Warhol's clean lines and fetish for the familiar. The man who once said, "Machines have less problems," ends up inspiring a generation of creators who merge art with technology, treating screens and pixels as new canvases. And then there's the internet, his true legacy. If Warhol were alive to see social media, he'd probably scroll through TikTok or Instagram, amused and unsurprised. Every selfie, every viral trend, every pop culture remix is, in some way, his prophecy fulfilled. Fame, once distant and divine, is now democratic. Everyone can curate their own image, reproduce it endlessly, and call it identity. We're all living inside Warhol's factory now, only this time, the screen is our studio. Still, for all his foresight, there's something quietly tragic in how well he predicted our world. His art warned us about the flattening of feeling, about the danger of confusing visibility with meaning, and yet we keep repeating the same patterns he painted 50 years ago, scrolling, consuming, imitating. Perhaps that's why his work feels more alive than ever. It doesn't just describe us, it is us. In museums today, people still stand in front of his Marilyns, his electric chairs, his flowers, his self-portraits. Some smile, some shrug, some take photos and move on. But once in a while, someone lingers. They lean in, notice the imperfections, the fingerprints, the smudges, the human residue beneath all that mechanical polish. And for a brief moment, they see him not as an icon, but as a person trying to understand what it means to be one. Because maybe that's the secret Andy never said out loud. Maybe he wasn't trying to make fun of fame or glorify it. Maybe he was trying to survive it. He once joked that he wanted to be a machine, but machines don't bleed, or dream, or fear being forgotten. Andy did all three. So when you think about him, his silver wig, his deadpan stare, his endless self-repetition, remember that it wasn't apathy, it was endurance. It was a way of navigating a world that couldn't tell the difference between attention and affection. And that's why, decades later, his story still feels unfinished. Because Andy Warhol didn't just change art, he changed the texture of reality itself. He showed us that beauty could be mass-produced, that irony could be sincere, and that the boundary between self and symbol was thinner than anyone dared admit. He once said, "They always say time changes things, but you actually have to change them yourself." Perhaps he did. Or perhaps he simply held up the mirror long enough for the rest of us to see who we really were. And now, as the lights dim in our imaginary studio, let's slow everything down. The silver gleam fades to grey, the hum of the city softens, and for a moment, it's just quiet again, like the pause after a Polaroid clicks, waiting for the image to appear. Andy's story doesn't end with a bang or a headline. It dissolves, gently, into reflection into the spaces between his images, where silence finally speaks louder than color. Maybe that's the real legacy. Not the fame, not the factory, but the feeling of stillness that follows, the reminder that behind every bright surface, there's a quiet pulse of humanity. So, if you're listening to this in the dark, somewhere between wake and sleep, maybe think of him not as the pop king or the enigma in silver, but as a mirror one that still catches light, even in shadow. Because every time someone snaps a photo, repeats an image, or turns their life into art, a little bit of Warhol hums in the background. Now, take a slow breath. Let it go. The noise of the day fades. You're already drifting, floating through the afterglow of neon and nostalgia. Good night, Andy. Good night, listener. And remember, fame fades, but the dream keeps shimmering.